Jenny Hoskins is next. The Hawaii, sorry. Jenny Hoskins, the Hawaii Bird Lead for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Birds and Habitat Programs, and will speak about applicable federal laws and future PUEO studies. Actually, Jason Misaki, the Oahu District Wildlife Manager for DLNR, was scheduled to speak this evening about applicable state laws and a future PUEO study. However, he could not make it. He has been called out to deal with a brush fire out in the Honouliuli Forest Reserve. And I'll go, but let's have Jenny come up first before we go into that. All right.
Aloha. I'd like to give you some information about the federal laws protecting the PUEO in Hawaii. Most people are familiar with the Endangered Species Act, or ESA. There's another federal law called the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which also protects native birds in Hawaii. And the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, or MBTA, is actually a set of 4 international treaties between the United States and Canada, Mexico, Russia, and Japan. MBTA does not make headlines as often as ESA does, but it's actually one of the oldest wildlife conservation laws in existence. The first treaty between the US and Canada was signed on August 16th, 1916, and it was the first international treaty ever for wildlife conservation, and we're celebrating our centennial anniversary this week. So these treaties, the impetus for the treaties was what was recognized even in the early 1900s as declining populations due largely to basically unregulated slaughter, both for food for sale and for the millinery trade, for hats, for feathers in women's hats. And it's estimated that tens of thousands of birds were slaughtered for profit before regulations went into effect. And it was also recognized at that time that these birds were a shared resource. Many birds do migrate, and it doesn't do much good to protect them in their wintering habitat if they're dying off in their breeding habitat. It is a little bit confusing because it protects not only migrants. The way the treaties are written, species are protected by family. Each of the 4 treaties identifies the birds that are protected, and 3 of them identify whole families of birds. So any bird that's found in that scientific family is automatically protected. And it's not always straightforward what species are protected. There are 2 criteria. The species has to be listed as an individual or as a member of a family that is identified specifically in one of the treaties, and it has to occur naturally somewhere in an area under U.S. jurisdiction. And that means that it came in on its own and it wasn't brought in strictly due to human intervention. Once a species is protected, it's protected everywhere it occurs. And I put the barn owl up here because that's a really good example of a species that is not native to Hawaii. It was brought in on purpose, but it was already protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, so it is still federally protected here, even though it's not native to the state. And captive bred birds are also protected, so this would apply to things like scientific installations doing captive breeding programs. All of the species that are protected under MBTA can be found in the Code of Federal Regulations, and you can identify, the list currently protects more than 1,000 species, 1,027, and you can access the full list online. What is not protected goes back to those same 2 criteria. Any species that was not mentioned specifically in one of the treaties, or any species that does not naturally occur in the US. In this example, the white-rumped shama was brought in deliberately by people, and it does not occur anywhere else in the US either. And some of our native species, including the monarch flycatchers and parrots, even though they're native, they were not listed in any of the treaties, and so MBTA doesn't protect them because the treaty is dependent on the international legislation. And also the upland game birds. A decision was made way back at the beginning that these birds would be protected under state law instead of federal. So what does it mean to be protected by MBTA? The MBTA prohibits take, and there is this legal definition of take, to conduct any of these activities at any time, by any means, or in any manner. And the take prohibition applies to whole birds, alive or dead, to their parts, to articles made from their parts, to their chicks, and to their eggs, unless permitted. There is a mechanism in the regulation to issue permits when needed. There was recognition that permits could be needed for things like scientific collecting, for wildlife rehabilitation, for anything that requires take of birds from the wild or possession of birds. or their parts, taxidermy, museum mounts, those all require permits. One of the more common permits that we issue for take is a depredation permit, and those are issued when species congregate in such numbers or in such a fashion that they are causing economic damage to agricultural crops or to buildings or to other wildlife, particularly threatened and endangered species, or if they're creating a human health hazard, such as airport bash programs where the birds represent a potential airstrike. And in some circumstances, if the damage caused by these birds is consistent enough and repeated enough, we issue a kind of expanded depredation permit called a depredation order, which is the same thing. It's very strictly limited to who can participate and what means they can use to take birds. The only difference is that a depredation permit has to be renewed every year and the depredation order doesn't. Now, I want to bring up the distinction between MBTA and the Endangered Species Act here, because the definition of take under MBTA basically includes pursue, capture, and possess. The Endangered Species Act adds the terms harass and harm. Those are not present under MBTA. So under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, it's legal to go out and wave your arms and scare a bird away. Under ESA, it's not, without a permit. And there's those legal definitions for harass and harm. This becomes important when you start looking at habitat. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act does not protect habitat. It only protects the birds. The MBTA policy is that if you are conducting habitat manipulations that will actually cause death of a bird, that's considered take and it's a violation. If you're causing habitat alteration that doesn't result in take, it's usually not considered a violation, and I have to put the usually in there for legal reasons, although I know very few circumstances where that actually happens. So this is important if you're conducting activities during the breeding season. If you're doing habitat alteration during the breeding season and there are migratory bird protected species in the area, your action will likely result in take, and so that has to be planned around. Under ESA, because their definition of take includes harass and harm, habitat is also protected because destroying the habitat causes harm to the species even if you don't kill it directly. MBTA does not give us that protection. So when does MBTA matter? Basically, it matters when you're conducting any activity that could result in impacts to migratory birds, and especially in any activity that requires analysis under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. Anything that requires an EA, an environmental assessment, or an environmental impact statement, and that usually means anything that is done with federal money or by a federal agency. So something as simple as cutting down an ohia tree that has an amakihi nest is under the jurisdiction of MBTA, or clearing a huge section of a mountain to build a highway. Under the National Environmental Protection Act, the requirement to analyze impacts to MBTA species is the same as it is under ESA. There's a certain process, I'm not going to go through this whole graph here, but a process that you go through to do your analysis under NEPA. And for the species, the law requires that you do the same thing for MBTA protected species as far as doing inventories to identify the species present, the time of year they're present, the type of habitat that they use, determining whether or not your activity will have impacts, and then whether or not those activities are significant. The difference between MBTA and ESA is that under ESA you also have to analyze habitat impacts, and there's a mechanism for providing mitigation. Under MBTA, you don't have to address the habitat, you just have to address the impacts to species. And anyone who is going through this process, we're more than happy to help. So, several people have touched on what we know about PUEO, which is kind of a foggy area. Basically, what we know is that they do still occur on all the main Hawaiian islands, occasionally on the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. I believe there's a recently established small population on Johnston Atoll. BBL is the bird banding lab. It's a USGS facility, and they handle all the records for nationally banded birds, and nationwide there have only been 26 individual PUEO banded ever. NatureServe is a nonprofit that does conservation assessments. They have determined that the PUEO should be listed as imperiled under their guidelines because of its restricted geographic range. And as we've heard, and you'll hear more later, they are state listed as endangered on this island. We don't have any reliable population size assessments. We don't really know trends, whether they're increasing, decreasing, or stable. CBC here is the Christmas bird count. It's a private citizen effort that happens one day every year where private citizens go out to predetermined locations and conduct bird counts. The way the Christmas bird count is set up, it's not really good for counting PUEO because it doesn't take into account their habitat use or the time of day when they're most active. So we have some educated guesses, as Loyal said, about what our trends are doing, but we don't have the data to back it up. We don't know how much they move between islands. We don't know how widespread they are on the islands, and we have limited understanding of their ecology. Again, as Mike said, we have some anecdotal reports and some observations of certain nesting behaviors, but not enough to say that they all do this or that they do this on every island. With habitat loss, with climate change, with management actions and invasive species, the need to gain this information is really becoming urgent. And as it turned out, Senator Gabbard mentioned earlier, we discovered in the process of setting up for this meeting that a couple of us had already started thinking about this and talking about doing the research. My involvement came about from the Kaho'olawe Island Reserve Commission. They are working with Island Conservation and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to restore seabird habitat on Kaho'olawe. So they got the Maui Seabird Recovery Group involved, and they approached my office looking for funding. And that's how I found out about it. And I started talking to the National Raptor Group, and we decided that we didn't want to just limit this to Kaho. We would like to start doing surveys nationwide, and we started putting together plans for that. And then we found out that Department of Land and Natural Resources was also planning on doing that, specifically on DOFA, to address some of the needs of this state-listed population. And so, as Senator Gabbard said, we have now been talking, and we're looking at ways that we can coordinate our efforts and share the data that we gain from that. Specifically on Kaho, they are looking at the use of rodenticide, which can have significant impacts on any raptor in the area. And so that's why that research initially started. Our objectives as we go into this are, first of all, just to determine what the best methods for research are. We can take some data that's available from other short-eared owl populations on the mainland and try that here and see if it works for PUEO. We know that there are some minor differences, but there should be a lot of similarities because they're a subspecies. And so we'll conduct kind of a feasibility study, a pilot study, to test the best research methods, the best survey methods, the best capture and marking methods. Initially, the Fish and Wildlife Service is going to focus its efforts on Hawaii, Maui, and Kaho'olawe, working again cooperatively with DLNR on this island. If it works out to be feasible, at some point we'd like to do some marking, put some radio transmitters on birds so that we can see what kind of movements they make, if they are in fact moving between islands. And the initial data that we'll use will be used to create a larger study, a long-term study, so that we can get a much better handle on all of that missing information. Our goal is to start surveys this fall. I've been out doing some scouting, and we'll start standardized surveys on the Big Island within the next week or two. And these initial surveys on all 4 islands will be used to test our methods and identify the areas that they use in potential territories. And that's what I...
Thank you, Jenny. And now we'll have Afshin Siddiqui, a wildlife biologist for the Department of Land and Natural Resources, speak on behalf of Jason.